Hello, dears. This is the Story Sculpt channel, and you are listening to the story, A Pair of Jeans. This story is taken from the book, A Pair of Jeans by Qaisra Shahraz. Miriam slid off the bus seat and glanced quickly at her watch. They were coming, and she was very late. Murmuring her goodbye to her two university friends, she made her way to the door and waited for her bus stop to approach. Once there, she got off the bus and hurriedly waved goodbye to her friends again. She pulled the jacket close to her body, becoming suddenly very self-conscious about her jean-clad legs and the short vest she wore beneath it. It had, unfortunately, shrunk in the wash. All day she had kept pulling it down to cover her midriff. Strange, but she felt odd in her clothing. Yet they were just the type of clothes she had needed to wear today, for hill walking in the Peak District in the northwest of England. Somehow here, in the vicinity of her home, however, she felt different. As she crossed the road and headed for her own street, she was very conscious of her appearance and hoped that she would not meet anyone she knew. She tugged at the hemline of her vest. It had ridden up yet again. With the other hand, she held on to the jacket front as it had no buttons. Her mind turned to the outing. It had been a wonderful day, but her legs ached after climbing all those green hills. Still, it was worth it. Her eye on her watch, she quickened her pace. It was much later than she had anticipated. She remembered the phone call of yesterday evening. They said they were coming today. What if they had already arrived? She glanced down at her tightly jean-clad legs. As soon as she got home, she must discreetly make her way to her room and quickly get changed. Just as Miriam reached the gate of her semi-detached house, she heard a car pull up behind her. Nervously, she swept round to see who it was. On spotting the color of the car and the person behind the wheel, her step faltered, color ebbing from her face. On the pretense of opening the gate, she turned round and tried to collect her wits about her. Too late. They were already here. Her heart was now rocking madly against her chest, and the clothes burned her. She wanted to quickly rush inside her home and peel them off. She clutched at her jacket front, covering her waist. She braced her shoulders. She could not scurry inside. That was not the way things were done, no matter what the circumstances. Calmly let go of the gate and turned round to greet the two people who had by now stepped out of the car and were surveying her. She didn't realize that she had let go of her jacket too. It fell wide open, revealing the short vest underneath. Their eyes fell straight to the inch of flesh at her waist. The woman was her future mother-in-law, a slightly frail woman dressed in shalwar and camise with a chador around her shoulders. The elderly man, behind the wheel earlier, was the woman's husband. He seemed to tower behind his wife. Miriam found herself unable to look either of them in the eye. A watery, hesitant smile played around her mouth. She did not know what to do or how to act. Her cheeks burnt in embarrassment, poise now very much lost. And yet these were the very people she wanted to impress. All she was aware of was the surreptitious glances they darted at her. In fact, not at her as Miriam, but at the figure, the appearance she presented clad in a pair of levis and a skimpy leather jacket to top it off. This was not the Miriam they knew, but a stranger, a Western version of Miriam. She immediately sensed their awkwardness. They too were caught off guard and did not know what to do with themselves, in particular with their eyes. The father-in-law was bent on avoiding eye contact with her by studiously looking above her head. He pushed the gate open and in 2 strides had crossed the driveway and was now solidly knocking on the front door. Miriam stepped aside to let the woman pass, silently walking behind her husband. Normally, she wouldn't have batted an eyelid if her daughter had turned up at her door at 11 o'clock at night, as long as she knew where she was and with whom and at what time she was returning home. Today, however, she was viewing her daughter's arrival and appearance through a different set of lenses. In fact, through the lenses of Miriam's future in-laws, the view just didn't look very good. In one glance, she took in her daughter's appearance. The jeans which wouldn't have normally aroused her interest, today stood out brazenly on Miriam's body, tightly molded against her full legs. Fatima couldn't quite make herself understand why she felt ashamed of her daughter's clothing and why she was suddenly angry with her for being seen like this. Her eyes gaped at Miriam's midriff showing through. Heat was now rushing through Fatima's cheeks. An inch of her daughter's flesh was visible. Her mind reeling and the urge to usher her out of sight strong, Fatima communicated her displeasure and desperately signaled with her eyebrows to her daughter to go up and change into something more respectable. Miriam understood and was only too glad to oblige. Squeezing past her mother and out of sight of their guests who had now entered their living room, Miriam almost ran up the stairs to her bedroom. Once there, she shut the door behind her and breathed out deeply. Her earlier feeling of tiredness and exhilaration from the hill walking had vanished. Instead, discontent had taken its place. A mere 2 steps into her home had led to another world. The other she had left behind with her friends on the bus. She shrugged the feeling aside. What mattered now were the 2 people downstairs. And they mattered. Her future lay with them. Going further into the room, she peeled off her jacket, vest, and tight pair of jeans, and let them fall, lying in a clutter on the woolen carpet. She looked down at them with distaste. Her mouth twisted into a cynical line. Damn it! Her mind shouted, rebelling. I am still the same young woman they visited regularly, the person that they have happily chosen as a bride for their son in their household. Deny it as much as you like, Miriam, her heart whispered back. It's no use. They have seen another side of you, your other persona. The other persona had apparently, by either sheer accident or mere contrivance, remained hidden from them from the very beginning. When they first saw her at a party, she was dressed in a maroon chiffon sari, and on each later occasion she was always smartly but discreetly and respectably dressed in a traditional shalwar kameez suit. Never at any time had they glimpsed a tightly jean-clad Miriam with an inch of midriff showing. In fact, judging by her mother's expression and lack of composure, it must have been a nasty shock. For now, they were seeing her as a young college woman who was very much under the sway of Western fashion and, by extension, its moral values. Muslim girls do not go outdoors dressed like that, especially in the short jacket, which hardly covered her hips, and a skimpy vest. She had heard of stories about in-laws who were prejudiced against such girls. For they weren't the docile, the obedient and sweet daughters-in-law that they preferred. On the contrary, they were seen as a threat and portrayed as rebellious hoydens who did not respect either their husbands or their in-laws. Miriam was all too familiar with such stereotyped views of women. From her wardrobe, she pulled off a blue crepe shalwar kameez suit from a hanger. As she put it on, her rebellious spirit reared its head again. They are only clothes, her mind hissed in anger. She could not deny the fact, however, that having them on her back she had embraced a new set of values. In fact, a new personality. Her body was now modestly swathed in an elegant long tunic and baggy trousers. The curvy contours of her female body were discreetly draped. With a quick glance in the mirror, she left her room. It was a confident woman gliding down the stairs. She was now in full control of herself. There was to be no scuttling down the stairs. Her poise was back. Her long dupatta scarf was draped around her shoulders, and one edge of it was over her head. Once downstairs in the hallway, outside the sitting room door, she halted, her hypocrisy galling her. She was neatly acting out a role, the one that her future in-laws preferred. A role of a demure and elegant bride and daughter-in-law, dressed modestly, with her body properly covered. Yet she was the same person who had earlier traipsed the Pennine countryside in a tight pair of jeans and walking boots, and who was now dressed in the height of Pakistani fashion. The difference lay in what her in-laws regarded and termed as an acceptable mode of dress. Or was she the same person? She didn't know. Perhaps it was true that there were 2 sides to her character. A person who spontaneously switched from one setting to another, from one mode of dress into another, in short, swapping one identity for another. Now, dressed as she was part and parcel of another identity, of another world, that of a Muslim Asian environment. Ensconced now in the other home ground, her thoughts, actions and feelings had seamlessly altered accordingly. Her head held high, Miriam entered the living room. Once inside, she felt 4 pairs of eyes turn in her direction. She stared ahead, knowing instinctively that apart from her father's, those eyes were busy comparing her present demure appearance with her earlier one. It was amazing how she was able to move around the room at ease, in her shell-work camise suit, in a manner that she could never have done in her earlier clothes amongst these people. She sat down beside her mother, acutely aware of her mother-in-law's eyes, discreetly appraising both her appearance and her movements. After a while, the conversation flagged. Fatima was doing her very best at entertaining and trying to revive a number of topics of interest to the other couple. The 2 guests, however, seemed to shy away. In particular, from the one concerning their children's marriage in 6 months' time. Miriam sat up, noticing that they were ill at ease and had made no direct eye contact with her. This was so unlike their usual behavior. There were moments, too, when husband and wife had exchanged surreptitious glances. Fatima was now quite anxious. From the moment her guests had stepped into their home, her instinct told her that something was wrong. She was ready to discuss the subject with them. But first she requested her daughter to bring in some refreshments. The dinner had already been prepared and laid out on the dining table in the kitchen. Miriam was only too happy to leave the room. Behind her a hushed silence reigned. She pottered around the kitchen, collecting bits and pieces of crockery from the cupboards. Her own hunger had vanished. The appearance of those 2 people had done a miraculous thing to her metabolic system. She was arranging the plates and glasses on the tray when she heard their voices in the hallway. They sounded as if were saying goodbye to her parents in the hallway. Surprised, Miriam hastened and picked up the tray. Were they going already? They hadn't eaten anything. The table was laid for dinner. She called Auntie, addressing her future mother-in-law. She turned and smiled. They were in a hurry to get home, because they had guests staying in their home, she informed. That is a lousy excuse, Miriam thought. If they had guests at home, why did they bother to come in the first place, anyway? Still dwelling on the subject, she returned to the kitchen and put the tray back on the table. What a waste of time. The 2 parents-in-law walked to their car in silence. Both were lost in their own thoughts. The silence continued during their journey. There was no need for communication. Somehow they could guess what the other was thinking about and read each other's thoughts fairly accurately. On reaching home, the so-called guest to whom Begum had referred earlier had apparently gone. Their elder son, Farouk, was not yet in. The younger was upstairs, studying for his GCSE examinations. They could hear the music from the CD disc blaring away. He loved listening to songs as he revised. Ayub shed his jacket and hung it in the hallway and went straight to the living room. Begum followed behind, also taking off her coat and outdoor shawl. Switching on the television, Ayub sat down in his armchair. Begum hovered listlessly near his armchair for a minute, looking down at her husband, waiting. Then mechanically folding her woolen shawl into its customary neat folds, she left the room and went upstairs to her bedroom to place it in her drawer. For a few moments she stood lost in her thoughts, looking out of the bedroom window. Mrs. Williams had another car. This was the 3rd in 6 months. What did she do with them? Then she heard her husband call her name, his voice supremely autocratic. Mrs. Williams and her love of cars put aside, Begum returned to the living room and sat down on the sofa opposite her husband, waiting for him to begin. Her heartbeat had automatically quickened. The seconds were ticking away into minutes, and her husband, however, still had made no move to say anything, his gaze on the newscaster. Instead, she picked up the Urdu national newspaper Daily Jang from the coffee table and began to read it. More precisely, she was pretending to read it. The words were a blur in front of her eyes. Ayub, at last, stood up, stretching out his legs. Striding across the room, he switched off the television. Returning to his chair, his pointed gaze now fell on his wife. Well, he began softly. It was now her turn to play. She pretended not to hear him or understand the implication of his exclamation, well. Now that the moment of reckoning had come, she absurdly wanted to prevaricate, to put the discussion off. Well, what? She responded coldly, buying time, peeping at her unsmiling husband over the edge of the newspaper. You know very well what I mean. Don't pretend to misunderstand me, Begum, he rasped under his breath, not at all amused by her manner, tone, or her words. Begum calmly examined the harsh outlines of her husband's unsmiling face. She was lost. She did not know what to say, or how to say it, although she knew the subject he was referring to. Thus her lips would not open, she simply stared at him. Well, what do you think of your future daughter-in-law? I thought you told me that she was a very sharif, a very modest girl. Was that naked waist what you would call modest? He glanced at her. I am sure she is. Begum defensively volunteered, feeling hedged. After all, she was the one who had originally taken a liking to Miriam. Huh, Ayub grunted. Sharif. Dressed like that. God knows who has seen her. Would you like any of your friends and relatives to have seen her as she appeared today? Would you, Begum? The voice was cutting. But she's a college student. College students do dress like that. Haven't you yourself joked about tatty jean-clad university students? Begum boldly persisted. She wanted to excuse Miriam's mode of dress to herself and to him. She knew she was not going to make a success of it because, secretly in her own heart, she very much agreed with her husband. Tell me, in those clothes of hers, would you be proud to have her as your daughter-in-law? I know I am not. You talk about her being a university student. Well, have you any idea what sort of company that she might be keeping with that lot? You've only seen her at odd times, and always at home. Do you know what she is really like? Have you thought of the effect she could have in your household? With her lifestyle, such girls also want a lot of freedom. In fact, they want to lead their lives the way their English college friends do. Did you notice what time she came in? She knew we were coming, yet that had not made any difference to her lifestyle. Do you expect her to change overnight in order to suit us? People form habits, Begum, do you understand? Are you prepared for a daughter-in-law who goes in and out of the house whenever she feels like it, dressed like that, and returns home as late as that? Don't your cheeks burn at the thought of that bit of flesh you saw? Imagine how our son will feel about her. I hope shame. And what if she has a boyfriend already? Have you thought of that? What if she has a boyfriend already? What if she takes drugs? What if? What if? So many questions to ask ourselves. Do you know? We do not know this girl at all, Begum. Can you guarantee that she will make our son happy? He paused strategically, waiting for her to say something. Begum, bemused, had nothing to add. The talking had become his arena, not hers. He continued. You know of a number of cases where the educated, the so-called modern girls have twined their husbands around their little fingers and expected them to dance to their tunes. Are you prepared for that to happen to your beloved son? To lose him to such a daughter-in-law? Have you the heart for that? Begum just stared, listening quietly to her husband's angry lecture. Deep down, however, in her own heart, she agreed with much of what he had said. Rattled by his tone and his words, she, however, was reluctant to voice her agreement. She hadn't quite anticipated the direction towards which the conversation was heading. After 25 years of marriage, she could read him like a book, his words, their nuance, the tilt of his eyebrow, the authoritative swing of his hand, the thin line of his mouth spelled only one message. She had already jumped ahead. With a sinking heart, she had guessed correctly the conclusion, the outcome of this discussion. She did not know how to react in front of him, nor did she disagree with him over anything he said. Not one jot. Her own thoughts had run in a similar direction. When she saw Miriam, standing near the garden gate with her jacket open, similar thoughts had whizzed through her mind too, although she would not have voiced them in such a harsh way. Her perception of what her daughter-in-law should be like did not quite tally with the picture that Miriam presented to them or to the clear picture that Ayub's words had conjured up. Why did that stupid girl have to wear those jeans and that vest today of all days? She angrily groaned inside her head. And why did Ayub have to see her like that? She had always reckoned on a conventional sort of daughter-in-law, the epitome of tradition. Definitely not one who was so strongly influenced by Western form of dress, culture, and probably feminist ideas as Miriam. The mad girl had no qualms about blatantly showing a part of her body in a public place. Begum shuddered. What about Farouk, their son? How would they deal with him? Luckily, it was not Farouk who had initially befriended Miriam, but she herself. A glimpse of Miriam at a hen party, had tugged at Begum's heart. From the first moment, she had fitted the epitome of what her future daughter-in-law should be like: young, beautiful, and well-educated. She had just obtained 3 A-levels at high grades from school and was now doing a geography degree at the university. Begum had liked the way Miriam had behaved, ever so correctly and gracefully. Above all, she had liked the way she dressed herself. How ironic that assumption was after today's event. It was the way the black chiffon sari had hugged her slender figure, and how her hair was elegantly wound up in a knot at the top of her head, just perfect. She was neither overdressed, nor overdecked in jewels, nor over-made up as some of her peers were wont to be. Nor, for that matter, was she over-boisterous or making a spectacle of herself as some of her friends did. In short, she had viewed her as the epitome of perfection, everything that was correct and appealing. She definitely had stood out from amongst the other girls. Looking back now, 2 years later, Begum was sure that, not her son, but she herself had fallen in love with Miriam at first sight, and not just that. Her name, Miriam, wove a magic spell around her. It had a special ring to it, and she had loved using it. And there was more. Begum had taken a real liking to Miriam's parents too, especially her mother. And liking one's child's in-laws, particularly the mother, was an important part of the equation. She knew of cases where the 2 mothers-in-law hated each other's guts and never quite got on with each other. Begum and Miriam's mother, Fatima, met for the first time at the Mendi party. After that, they became warm friends and were seen to be in and out of each other's homes. With the subject of their growing children's futures looming on their domestic horizons, the 2 mothers had, as a matter of course, discussed and dwelled at length on the subject of their children's marriage prospects. Farouk and Miriam had also met each other soon afterwards. Often accompanied by their parents, they too took a liking to each other. They found they were very compatible in their interests and personalities and had a lot to laugh about, often giggling together. When their parents suggested the idea of marriage, both heartily agreed. Farouk just couldn't help grinning all over. Miriam was struck with sudden shyness, her cheeks burning. Soon afterwards, an engagement party was held for the 2. In order to let them complete their respective courses, the wedding was to be postponed for a year or so. That was a year ago. Today, Farouk's parents went to meet Miriam's in order to discuss the arrangements for the forthcoming wedding in 6 months' time. They were to decide on the date and discuss possible venues for the 2 receptions. Instead, they had returned home without even mentioning the word wedding. Yet their thoughts were very much centered on that subject. However, more importantly on Miriam herself, her clothes and her body. Well, Ayub's cold prompting brought his wife to the present. Begum turned to look at her husband once more and calmly waited for him to finish what he was going to say. There was a speculative gleam in his eyes. "What are you going to do?" he rasped. This time she could not pretend to misunderstand him. She faced him squarely, poised for a battle. Yet as she was about to utter the words, her heart sank. For she saw her Miriam fast disappearing from the horizon. But then as she tried to clutch onto her image in her mind, there arose that one of her in that silly pair of faded jeans and that ridiculously short vest. Her heart sank. It had to be. It was better to face the matter now than regret it later. The problem was how she, Begum, was going to deal with it. She did not have the heart nor the courage to play the role demanded of her, nor the one that she inevitably had to play in this drama. Knowing her husband, she knew for sure that he would leave it to her to sort out the situation with the 2 parties, her son and Miriam and her family. Once again, she looked her husband directly in the eye. "You truly don't want the wedding to take place then?" she tentatively asked, still desperate to hold on to Miriam. Begum's gaze fell. His eyes crushed. "I thought I had already made myself obvious. What do you think?" He was enraged, and he let her know it. "I suppose I agree with what you say, but how are we going to go about it?" Begum stammered, the boldness gone, now very much resigned to both her and Miriam's fates. "I leave that entirely to you, especially as you were the one so hot on the girl. I am sure we can find lots of other women for our son. women who have a more discreet taste in clothing and a good understanding of female modesty. Similarly, I am sure her parents will find a man more suited to her lifestyle than our son, a man who has the capacity to tolerate her particular mode of dressing, for the want of a better word. They heard the front door open. That must be their Farouk. They stopped talking and stared at each other. Begum's heart was thumping away, dreading talking to him about Miriam. She felt like a traitor. Quickly getting up, she went into the kitchen to get his dinner. She hoped he would go straight to his room first. Ayub picked up the newspaper and began to read it. Miriam had just got in from university when she heard the phone ringing. She dashed down from her room to answer it. She faltered. It was Aunt Begum. She quickly obliged Begum in her request to speak to her mother and called her mother. Leaving the phone, she went into the living room and sat down to watch television. Fatima left the meal she was preparing and went to speak to Begum. They talked for nearly 5 minutes. There were several moments of awkward pauses on either side of the telephone receivers. By the time the conversation ended, a pinched look had settled around Fatima's mouth. Begum had nervously said her salam. Fatima had quite literally forgotten to return the greeting at the end, but silently put the receiver down. Her eyes stared at the wall. At the other end, with her head bent over her legs, Begum thanked Allah that it was over and done with. She sank down against the banister of the stairs. She felt bad. Oh God, terribly bad. She had hated herself every minute of that conversation and the role she had been forced to play. Putting herself in Fatima's position, she realized how painful it must be for her. How would she feel if she had found out that her daughter was to be jilted at the last minute? Mechanically, as if in a daze, and with her hand held against her temple, Fatima, for her part, went into the living room. Going to the sofa, she sat down and absent-mindedly pushed the cushion aside and stared in front of her at the fireplace. Miriam did not notice anything unusual about her mother until she realized that her mother had not said a word since she entered the room. "What did Aunt Begum say?" she asked quietly. Her heart's rhythm had altered for some reason. Fatima stalled as she sought to answer her daughter's question. She was not yet ready to divulge what she had learned. She was still reeling from the shock herself. What would it do to her daughter? She turned her face away from her daughter. "What is it, mother?" Miriam's heart had now gained a steady, sharp beat. Dread entered. "What did Aunt Begum say?" she asked again. Unable to control herself any longer, Fatima bitterly burst out with, "She said that your engagement had to be broken off." Miriam paled. Her heart had now sunk to the pit of her stomach. "Why, mother?" she said quietly. She was amazed at how clearly her mind was functioning, although a buzzing sound seemed to hammer in her head. "She said that they came yesterday to inform us, but found it impossible to get around to doing so. Begum says that her sister insists that her daughter was betrothed to Farouk, that they were well matched together. She says she is very sorry and apologizes, but apparently her sister comes first. Liars. What a lousy excuse." Miriam's mind screamed, but she uttered not a word, instead left the room. She ran upstairs to her bedroom and closed the door behind her. Standing in the middle of the room, she drew in a deep breath. Where did the sister come from? Why was it she was never heard of before? Not to marry Farouk? Miriam voiced loudly. Why, only yesterday she was planning how they were going to lead their lives together. In fact, deciding in which area they were going to purchase their house after they got married and had jobs. Her mouth twisted into a cynical line. In her heart, she knew. From that first moment she saw them that night in her jeans and short vest, she had had a dreadful premonition. She had known, although she had denied it emphatically to herself, that something was wrong or bound to go wrong. Their faces, their body language had told the whole story. The buzzing sound was still hammering in her head. Going to her wardrobe, she pulled it open and looked inside. Her eyes sought wildly and her hands rummaged through the clothes and the hangers until she found what she was seeking. She pulled off from the hanger the repugnant-looking article and threw it on the floor, as if it burned her to hold it. She stared at it as if mesmerized by it. Then with her foot she gave it a vicious kick. Her mouth resumed its cynical twist. Her friends would never believe her if she told them. The shabby-looking and much-worn pair of jeans lay nonchalantly near the end of the bed, blissfully unaware of the havoc it had created in the life of its wearer. She stepped over the pair of jeans and looked at herself in the long mirror on the wall. Eyes widening, she scrutinized her face and body for any telltale signs of her inner turmoil. Her face looked haggard. The mouth, which was normally full-lipped, was now a thin, sharp, pinkish line. There was a certain stiffness about her, the way her shoulders sloped down, as if carrying her body was an immense ordeal. Angrily, she swept away from the mirror and went to the window to look down at the lawn and flower beds in the rear garden. Ideas and thoughts jolted and formed in her head, each vying with the other for attention. One idea, however, lodged itself firmly in her mind. Farouk and his parents weren't going to get away with it. "They can't do this to me," her mind screamed. She didn't know whether Farouk knew about this matter, but she was going to make sure that he definitely did, and there was only one way of finding out if he didn't. She noticed that the flowers below were in full bloom. The color of those roses reminded her of the bridal bouquet she was planning for herself. All of a sudden, her body relaxed and she felt a certain calmness descend over her as she closed her bedroom door behind her. There was no rushing. She simply glided down the stairs and had begun to dial Farouk's phone number on her mobile by the time she reached the hallway. As the phone bell pipped away at the other end, her heart skipped a beat for a fraction of a second. What if his mother or father picked up the phone? What would she say to them? She was about to snap her mobile shut when rebellion surfaced again. She shook her fears aside. So what if they answered the phone? She would deal with them and the situation as it arose. To her dismay, nobody answered the phone at the other end. She tried again, defiantly letting it ring for 2 minutes. Somebody was going to answer it one way or another. Her mother came out of the kitchen and saw Miriam with her mobile phone held fast to her ear. Miriam heard her mother's approach, turned and caught her eye. Fatima shot her a questioning glance. Who was she ringing? A worried look crossed her face. At last, somebody picked up the receiver. The ringing stopped and the word, "hello," was audible to Miriam's ear. Relief shot through her. It was her Farouk. She greeted him first with, "hello," and then with the Arabic, "assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you." She then reverted to speaking in English. "Farouk, it's Miriam." She tried to control the rhythm of her heartbeat and keep her voice steady. "How are you, Miriam?" "I am fine." She was staring at her mother. Fatima was desperately signaling her to end the call. Miriam ignored her mother's shaking hand and turned to look instead at the picture of a landscape on the wall opposite, concentrating on what she was saying. "Are you alone at home, Farouk, or are your parents with you? If they are there, I want us to meet in the student union." Tone brusque. "Usman is with me. Mom and Dad have gone out. They'll be back soon, though. Did you want to speak to them?" "No, it's you. I wanted to speak to you, Farouk." She paused for a few seconds, her heart thudding again, and then continued, still in control. "Have you heard anything about us, Farouk?" "Us? No. What do you mean, Miriam?" He was now quite intrigued. "Just as I thought." Her voice hardened, a bitter laugh echoing in her head. "It's probably too soon for them to break it to you. They are probably deciding what to do and how to put it to you." "Miriam, you've got me all puzzled now. Come on, girl, what is going on?" He nervously laughed. "I am sorry, Farouk. Just talking to myself. I know it's all in riddles to you, isn't it? Look, I can't say much more over the phone, but can I come and see you at home, and then we can talk together with your parents?" "Of course you can, Miriam, but really, you've now got me all worried, I must say." "It's nothing to fret about. I'll tell you in a short while. Huda Hafiz." Her voice and thoughts were calm again. Miriam switched off her phone and faced her mother. Fatima noted the distinct mutinous line of her daughter's mouth. She struggled to say the right thing, but not want to bruise her daughter's ego further. She had a duty, however, to advise her as a mother, but the right words just failed to spring to her aid. Finally, she softly offered, "Miriam, that wasn't the right thing to do or say." "The right thing to do?" Miriam ejaculated, stung. "Do you think Farouk's parents have done the right thing by me?" she hissed, her betrayed eyes darting an angry beam of light at her mother. Fatima realized her blunder. It was a mighty wrong thing to say under the circumstances. Of course her daughter had the right to feel as she did. So Fatima attempted to placate her with her next words. "I am sorry, Miriam, I didn't mean that. It's just that I thought that instead of you contacting Farouk, it should be us, your parents, doing it in the first place. That is the seemly thing to do." "Oh, mother, there you go on again about seemly things. There is nothing unseemly about me contacting my own fiancé." She laid extra stress on the word own. "After all, I am engaged to him, am I not? Or have you forgotten that too?" Angry heat was rushing out of her cheeks. "No, I haven't forgotten. There is no need for your sarcasm." Fatima snapped back, also now quite flushed, beginning to get irritated with her daughter and the situation in which she presently found herself. "I just mean that your father and I should go firstly to visit Farouk and his parents to discuss the matter. Do you think that we don't care about you, about how they have jilted you, and on what grounds? After all, it's a matter of our honor, the way we are being treated so shabbily, that our daughter is dropped like a sack of potatoes." I was under a great deal of shock when I listened to Begum earlier today on the phone, but now the shock has worn off, and like you I am very, very angry. She passionately ended, hoping to clarify her own feelings and position to her daughter. Miriam shrugged. "You can sort that out with father, Farouk and his parents, but I am going to see Farouk personally and right now, mother." A defiant tilt arched her eyebrows above her flashing eyes. Hoping that her mother had understood the message, Miriam swept round and went upstairs to her bedroom. Fatima stared after her daughter helplessly. She was in a real dilemma. She wanted to tell and advise Miriam that she shouldn't meet Farouk until they themselves had met his parents. At the same time, she felt deeply for her daughter and wanted to support her in any way that she could. Never before had she felt the gulf between Miriam's generation and her own so keenly. The generation and culture gap lay between them as wide as the ocean. She never did this sort of thing in her youth. Unthinkable. No matter what happened, the parents saw to everything. It was they who resolved problems. Children did not take things into their own hands. Pakistan was so far from Britain. It was another place, and she was thinking of another time. As her daughter had said, it wasn't a matter of what was the right thing to do convention-wise, but it was time for positive action. If Miriam thought she had a right to consult Farouk about this matter, then she had every right to do so, and she, as her mother, would support her. Times had indeed changed. They lived and were brought up in different worlds, traditions, and cultures. Above all, the world was quickly changing around them. Returning to the lounge, she stood listlessly in the middle. It was a pity that her husband was not in. He would have seen to everything. What would have happened if, instead of her husband had picked up the phone? She wondered wryly, would Begum have said the same to her husband that she had said to her? Probably not, she thought cynically. Inside, her blood raged, feeling so terribly bitter. What had their daughter done to deserve to be treated in such a fashion? It was a great insult for all of them. She herself had so liked Begum. Up till this evening she had prided herself on gaining a good Kurmani, a mother-in-law for her daughter. They had also become good friends over the time they had known each other. And now this. She heard her daughter's steps on the stairs, light and jaunty. Miriam entered the room. Fatima turned to look at her daughter. Her eyes widened ever so slightly as they swept over Miriam's body. Then her gaze met Miriam's and was held there. There was a challenging look in her daughter's eyes. Fatima registered the look and accepted it wordlessly. Miriam waited for her mother to make some comment about her appearance. Under her mother's shocked gaze, she held herself tall and erect, the mutinous line of her mouth very much prominent. "I am going to see Farouk, mother," she softly informed and waited, giving her mother sufficient time to say something. Fatima said nothing, her gaze dropped. Miriam then turned and left the room. The outside door clicked shut behind her. Fatima moved to the window. It looked onto the front garden and its driveway. She saw her daughter shut the garden gate behind her. Then placing one hand in the pocket of her faded pair of jeans, while the other held the short jacket tightly against her chest, Miriam began to walk away.